January 7, 1943. Tunisia, dawn. The desert air hung cold and still over the Kasserine Pass. Lieutenant Hans Becker stood in the commander's cupola of his Panzer IV, scanning the horizon through Zeiss optics that could pick out a man at 2,000 meters. The machine beneath him was a Predator. 50 tons of Krupp steel, a long-barreled 75mm gun that could punch through any Allied tank at ranges the enemy couldn't even dream of engaging from. The engine idled with a low, confident growl. Around him, his crew moved with the precision of men who knew their weapon was superior. They had trained for years. They had perfected their craft in the snows of Russia, in the sands of Libya. They were Panzerwaffe the elite. When the first American tanks appeared on the ridgeline that morning, Becker smiled. He had heard the intelligence reports. M4 Shermans, 30 tons, 75mm gun, adequate armor, nothing exceptional, nothing to fear. Through his periscope, he counted them, 5, then 8, then 12, rolling across the hardpan in loose formation. They moved cautiously, almost hesitantly, their commanders clearly inexperienced. Fresh from the factories of a nation that had never known war on its soil. Becker turned to his gunner and said what many German tank commanders would say in the months to come. Plenty of targets. Make each shot count. What Hans Becker did not know, what no German tanker could have known that cold January morning, was that he was not looking at an army. He was looking at the leading edge of an industrial tsunami that would within 2 years drown the Wehrmacht in a flood of steel so vast, so relentless, that all the tactical brilliance, all the superior engineering, all the courage of the Panzerwaffe would become irrelevant. The Shermans he saw were not rare weapons hoarded and precious. They were disposable, replaceable, the harbingers of a production miracle that would rewrite the mathematics of modern warfare. In the autumn of 1942, when the first reports of American medium tanks reached the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the response was almost dismissive. German intelligence had acquired detailed specifications of the M4 Sherman through espionage and captured examples from British forces in North Africa. The analysis was coldly professional. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate approximately 74mm of armor at 500 meters effective against the Panzer III and early Panzer IV models, but inadequate against the latest German armor. Its frontal armor was 50mm at the Glacus, vulnerable to the long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns that German forces fielded. Its vertical armor design created shot traps. Its gasoline engine had a troubling tendency to ignite when penetrated, earning it the grim nickname Ronson among British crews. Lights first time, every time. On paper, the Sherman was mediocre. German tank designers, who had spent years perfecting sloped armor, superior optics, and devastating guns, looked at the American tank and saw confirmation of their belief that German engineering represented the apex of armored warfare. The Panther tank, with its sloped frontal armor and long 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even scratch its paint. The Tiger, with its 88mm gun and massive armor, was virtually invulnerable to American tanks from the front. In tank versus tank combat, the mathematics were brutal. It was estimated that it took 5 Shermans to reliably destroy a single Panther, and the kill ratio bore that out. In Normandy, in the Ardennes, in the final battles in Germany itself, German tanks consistently achieved higher kill counts. But the German analysts made a fatal error. They were evaluating the Sherman as a weapon. They should have been evaluating it as a product. In the first 6 months of 1943, as German tank crews in Tunisia and Sicily were racking up impressive tallies against American armor, something extraordinary was happening in Detroit, in Gary, in the sprawling industrial belt of the American Midwest. The United States was producing Shermans at a rate that defied comprehension. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Michigan, the Fisher Tank Division, the Ford Motor Company, the Pressed Steel Car Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, Pacific Car and Foundry, 11 major manufacturers coordinating production across thousands of suppliers, churning out M4 Shermans in numbers that seemed impossible. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 21,000 Sherman tanks. 21,000. That was more tanks than Germany produced in the entire war, of all types, from all factories. By comparison, Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panzer IV tanks, their most common medium tank, during the same year, and barely 1,800 Panthers. The Tiger I, the most feared German tank, saw only 1,347 examples produced during its entire production run. The Tiger II, even fewer. Each Panther took approximately 55,000 man-hours to build. Each Sherman took 10,000. Each Tiger required hand-fitted parts, skilled craftsmen, specialty alloys that Germany's shrinking territory made increasingly scarce. Each Sherman was built on an assembly line with interchangeable parts, by workers who had been factory laborers 9 months earlier, from steel that poured from blast furnaces that would never see a bomb. The Sherman was not designed to be superior. It was designed to be producible. And that design philosophy, that uniquely American approach to warfare, would prove more devastating than any gun, any armor, any tactical doctrine. Oberst Ludwig Bauer commanded a Panther battalion in Normandy in June 1944. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a holder of the Knight's Cross, a man who understood armored warfare with an intimacy born of survival. His Panthers were magnificent machines, sleek, deadly, technically superior to anything the Allies fielded. On June 13, his battalion destroyed 17 Allied tanks in a single engagement near Villers-Bocage. His crews were jubilant. They had proven once again that German steel, German training, German fighting spirit could overcome numerical odds. But Ludwig Bauer was not jubilant. He stood that evening beside his command tank, watching the western horizon where the last light was fading, and he felt something he had not felt in Russia, even in the darkest moments of encirclement. He felt inevitability. Because for every Panther he commanded, he had counted 37 Shermans during that day's fighting. And while his battalion had destroyed 17 of them, the American formation had simply absorbed the losses and continued advancing. They didn't retreat. They didn't reorganize. They just kept coming, because behind those 37 tanks were 300 more, and behind those, 3,000. And behind those, the factories of Detroit were running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, producing 45 Shermans every single day of every single week. Bauer's crew had fought brilliantly. They had achieved a kill ratio that would have shattered any Soviet armored division. But by nightfall, his battalion had lost 3 Panthers, 1 to a lucky Sherman shot through the side armor, 1 to mechanical failure, and 1 to a fighter bomber that appeared so suddenly the crew never had a chance to fire. Those 3 Panthers were irreplaceable. There were no spare Panthers. There were no reserve units. The replacement parts were stuck somewhere in Germany, delayed by bombed rail lines. The factory that built Panthers was producing 12 per week when it wasn't being bombed. Meanwhile, the 17 Shermans his battalion had destroyed, they were already being replaced. American tank transporters were, at that very moment, hauling fresh Shermans from the beachhead supply dumps to the frontline units. New crews were being rushed through training. Replacement parts were stacked in warehouses in quantities that stunned German prisoners when they saw them. Ludwig Bauer wrote in his diary that night, "We are killing them at magnificent ratios, and we are losing." The mathematics of industrial attrition were elegant and merciless. Germany's entire tank production for 1944, the peak year, was approximately 19,000 armored vehicles of all types, including assault guns and tank destroyers. In that same year, The United States produced 17,500 Shermans alone, while simultaneously producing thousands of tank destroyers, light tanks, and armored vehicles, plus serving as the primary supplier of armor to British, Free French, and Soviet forces. The Soviet Union, fighting the bulk of the German army, produced another 29,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 1944. The arithmetic was simple. Germany was fighting a three-front industrial war it had no capacity to win. But beyond the raw numbers lay something more subtle and more devastating: the American logistics system. A Sherman tank that broke down in France was not abandoned. The USS Army had mobile maintenance battalions that could perform engine swaps in the field. They had supply chains that delivered spare parts to frontline units within 48 hours. They had tank transporters that could haul damaged vehicles to rear area workshops, where specialized teams would repair and return them to combat within a week. A Sherman with a thrown track could be operational again in hours. A Sherman with a burned-out engine could receive a replacement power plant from a stock of engines that numbered in the thousands. The American system treated tanks like ammunition: expendable, replaceable, abundant. German logistics was the opposite. A Panther with transmission problems, a chronic issue, might sit disabled for weeks waiting for parts. A Tiger with engine trouble might be cannibalized to keep another Tiger running. German mechanics were skilled craftsmen performing miracles with inadequate resources, but they were fighting entropy itself. By late 1944, more German tanks were lost to mechanical failure and lack of fuel than to enemy action. Units would report 50 tanks on paper, but only 15 operational. The rest sat immobilized, waiting for parts that would never arrive, or fuel from refineries that no longer existed, or transport on rail lines that had been bombed into scrap. The German tank crews learned to hate not the Sherman's gun, but its omnipresence. Lieutenant Werner Krauss commanded a Tiger I in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944. His tank was a beast, 60 tons, armor up to 120 mm thick, an 88 mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. During the first days of the offensive, his crew destroyed 9 American tanks without a single penetrating hit on their own armor. They felt invincible. But on the fourth day, advancing through a Belgian forest, Krauss encountered a traffic jam. German columns were stalled on narrow roads, waiting for fuel that was supposed to have been captured from American dumps, but somehow never materialized. His Tiger sat immobile for 6 hours, burning precious fuel, just idling to keep the engine from freezing. When they finally moved, they advanced 3 kilometers before encountering another American position. Through his optics, Krauss counted 14 Shermans in hull-down positions. He destroyed the first 2 at range. The others scattered and returned fire. His Tiger was hit 6 times. None penetrated, but one jammed his turret traverse. As his crew worked frantically to repair the mechanism, 4 more Shermans appeared from a different angle. Then, 3 more from another direction. The Americans weren't trying to destroy his Tiger in single combat. They were swarming it, surrounding it, probing for weaknesses. Krauss's gunner was magnificent, destroying 5 more Shermans, but now there were 8 visible, then 10, then 12. They just kept coming. The Americans were using radios to coordinate, calling in more tanks, more infantry, artillery. Krauss's Tiger was down to 15 rounds of main gun ammunition. The nearest German supply point was 20 kilometers behind them. The Americans had supply trucks following their tank columns. Krauss gave the order to retreat. His invincible Tiger, undefeated in direct combat, withdrew not because it was beaten, but because it was alone, because there was no fuel to advance, because there were no reinforcements, because the Wehrmacht was drowning in American steel and couldn't breathe. The American production miracle was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate choices made in the 1930s and accelerated after Pearl Harbor. The United States had something no other combatant possessed: massive industrial overcapacity and standardization culture. American factories had spent the 1920s and 1930s perfecting mass production techniques. The automotive industry had already solved problems of supply chain coordination, interchangeable parts, manufacturing, and high-volume assembly. When the U.S. Army approached Detroit in 1940 with plans for tank production, they weren't asking factories to learn new skills. They were asking them to build a slightly different product. The Sherman's design reflected this philosophy. It used an automotive-type engine, either a radial aircraft engine or, in many models, a multi-bank engine constructed from 5 automobile engines. Its transmission was based on automotive components. Its suspension could be serviced by mechanics trained on trucks. Its electrical system used standard commercial parts. The entire tank was designed around the principle that it would be maintained by soldiers with basic mechanical training, using parts that could be manufactured in thousands of factories across the continent. It was not the best tank. It was the most American tank: pragmatic, mass-produced, adequate for purpose, and available in overwhelming quantity. German tanks were marvels of engineering built by a machine tool industry that produced precision equipment for the most demanding specifications. They were sophisticated, powerful, and impossible to produce in the numbers required. The Panther's Maybach engine was a masterpiece that required specialty alloys and precision machining. Its transmission was so complex that even experienced crews struggled with its operation, and it was notorious for breaking down. The Tiger's overlapping road wheel design provided excellent ride quality, but was a nightmare in Russian winter when mud would freeze between the wheels, immobilizing the tank. German engineering excellence had produced superior weapons that couldn't be manufactured fast enough, couldn't be maintained in field conditions, and couldn't be replaced when lost. The Sherman was crude by comparison. Its vertical armor was mathematically inferior to sloped plate. Its gun was adequate, not excellent. Its gasoline engine was more flammable than diesel, but it worked. It was reliable. When it broke, farm boys from Iowa could fix it. When it was destroyed, another one arrived the next day. The Sherman represented a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare, one that accepted tactical losses in service of strategic victory through overwhelming material superiority. By the spring of 1945, the disparity had become grotesque. German Panzer divisions existed mostly on paper. Units that were supposed to field dozens of tanks reported to battle with a handful of operational vehicles. Crews were undertrained teenagers or overage men pulled from other services. Fuel was so scarce that tanks would be towed into position by horses to conserve gasoline for combat. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts no longer existed. The vaunted Panzerwaffe, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in days, was a hollow shell sustained only by the desperate courage of its crews. The American and British armies rolled across Germany with armored divisions that fielded hundreds of tanks each. When a Sherman was destroyed, the crew would often climb into a replacement tank within hours. Some crews went through 3 or 4 Shermans during the campaign, each time receiving a fresh vehicle from the seemingly bottomless supply system. American tank columns would bypass German strongpoints and keep advancing because they had the fuel to do so, the supplies to sustain the advance, and the replacement vehicles to absorb casualties. General-Lieutenant Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of German armored warfare, wrote in his memoirs about the bitter irony of the final months. Germany had developed superior tanks, the Panther, the Tiger II, the Jagdpanther tank destroyer. German crews, when they could engage on favorable terms, still achieved impressive kill ratios. But none of it mattered. The Allies had so many tanks that they could afford to use them, not just as combat vehicles, but as cargo carriers, recovery vehicles, engineering equipment. Guderian encountered a captured American supply depot in March 1945 that contained more spare tank parts than existed in all of Germany. The Americans were using Shermans to push rubble off roads because they had so many that it was more efficient than waiting for specialized bulldozers. The superiority that German tank crews had laughed about in 1943, the superior optics, the better guns, the thicker armor, had become a historical footnote. War was not a duel. It was not a test of technical excellence. War was mathematics, and America had solved the equation. The symbolic object of this transformation was not a weapon. It was a crate, a simple wooden crate stenciled with USS. Army markings, 18 inches by 12 inches by 6 inches, containing replacement parts for an M4 Sherman. Specifically, spark plugs, filters, gaskets, bushings, the small components that kept machinery running. These crates were stacked in warehouses in France, in Belgium, in England. They arrived on Liberty ships that the United States was producing at a rate of 3 per day. They were transported on trucks built by GMC and Chevrolet in numbers that exceeded the entire German motor pool. They represented something that German soldiers, schooled in a culture of scarcity and sacrifice, could not quite comprehend: abundance. Abundance as a weapon. Abundance as strategy. Abundance not of luxury items, but of the mundane components that made modern warfare possible. A German mechanic, nursing a broken Panther along with improvised parts and desperate ingenuity, would have wept to see an American maintenance depot where entire engines were replaced rather than repaired because it was faster. Where damaged components were simply thrown away because new ones were cheaper than repair time. Where supply officers worried not about having enough parts, but about where to store them all. This abundance flowed from factories that never saw combat, from a homeland that never knew bombing, from an economy that expanded during the war rather than contracting. While German women were melting down church bells for shell casings, American factories were producing so much steel that the primary challenge was logistics. How to ship it all to the combat zones fast enough. While German engineers were designing ever more sophisticated weapons to compensate for numerical inferiority, American engineers were optimizing production lines to shave minutes off assembly time. While German tank crews were hoarding ammunition for the perfect shot, American tankers were firing high explosive rounds at suspected positions because they had ammunition to waste. There is a photograph, taken in April 1945 near the Elbe River, that captures the endgame. In the foreground, a destroyed Tiger II, the most powerful tank Germany ever fielded, with armor impervious to anything except close-range flank shots. Its side armor has been penetrated multiple times. It sits immobilized, a monument to engineering excellence that arrived too late and in too few numbers. Behind it, stretching to the horizon, is an American armored column. Shermans, tank destroyers, half-tracks, trucks. The photographer counted over 200 vehicles in frame. They're not in combat formation. They're in road march, moving at speed, a river of steel and gasoline flowing east. The Tiger is a museum piece. The Shermans are an invasion. German tank crews who survived the war would tell stories in the decades after about the battles where they achieved miraculous kill ratios, where their technical superiority shone through. And those stories were true. German tanks were better. German crews were often more experienced. German tactical doctrine was sophisticated. But the veterans would also tell another story, whispered in the pauses between the glory tales. The story of looking through their periscopes and seeing not an enemy, but an inevitability. Seeing Shermans burning and knowing it didn't matter because more were coming, always more. An endless parade of adequate tanks crewed by adequate soldiers backed by a system that never ran out, never gave up, never stopped producing. The laughter that German tank crews shared in 1943, counting the Shermans and feeling superior, had died by 1944. It was replaced by a grim professionalism, a focus on survival rather than victory. By 1945, it had become something else, a kind of exhausted acceptance. You could destroy 5 Shermans and there would be 10 more. You could fight brilliantly and still be surrounded. You could have the better tank and lose anyway because war was not a contest of quality. It was a contest of systems, and the American system was as relentless as a glacier. The historical lesson of the Sherman is not found in its technical specifications. It is found in the choice it represented. The United States could have tried to build a better tank than the Panther. American engineers were capable of it, but that would have meant lower production numbers, longer development time, more complex maintenance, more training required. The U.S.S. Army made a different choice. Build a good enough tank in numbers so vast that it didn't matter if individually they were inferior. Win through logistics, through production capacity, through the unglamorous mathematics of supply lines and replacement rates. This was democracy's answer to totalitarian efficiency. Germany had organized its entire society around military excellence. It had subordinated every aspect of the economy to producing superior weapons. It had militarized the culture, indoctrinated the youth, sacrificed civilian needs to military requirements, and it produced magnificent weapons in inadequate numbers. The United States kept most of its population in civilian roles, maintained production of consumer goods even during the war, allowed labor unions to negotiate, and still outproduced the Axis powers combined. American abundance wasn't despite democracy, it was because of it. The same inefficient, chaotic, bottom-up decision-making that produced too many consumer brands also produced industrial flexibility that could be redirected to war production without breaking the underlying system. The Sherman was a product of committee design, multiple manufacturers, civilian contractors, automotive engineers adapting to military needs. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it won because the system that created it could build 10 Shermans for every Panther and could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Hans Becker, the tank commander who smiled at the sight of Shermans in Tunisia in January 1943, survived the war. He commanded tanks in Normandy, in the retreat across France, in the final defense of Germany. His diary, recovered by American forces, contains an entry from April 1945, written in a basement in Berlin while Soviet tanks rolled overhead. He wrote about Tunisia, about that morning when he saw his first Shermans and thought them inferior. He wrote about the years that followed, about watching the tide of American armor grow from a trickle to a flood. He wrote about the moment, he couldn't pinpoint exactly when, that he realized Germany had lost, not because its soldiers were inferior, not because its weapons were inadequate, but because it was fighting a kind of war it didn't understand. A war where quantity was its own quality, where logistics was more important than tactics, where the enemy's greatest weapon was not courage or skill, but the capacity to build faster than you could destroy. His final entry reads, "We were excellent. They were enough. In war, enough repeated infinitely defeats excellence every time." The Shermans rolled through Germany in the spring of 1945 like a steel tide, inexorable and infinite. They were scratched, dented, repaired, and replaced. Their crews were young men from America's farms and cities, most of whom had never seen a tank before the war. They were not super soldiers. They were adequate soldiers in adequate tanks, backed by a system so vast that adequacy became overwhelming. Behind them came the supply trucks, the fuel tankers, the maintenance units, the replacement depots. The entire apparatus of American industrial power compressed into mobile form, sustaining itself, repairing itself, replacing itself, advancing always forward because it could afford to absorb the losses and the enemy could not. German tank crews, when they could still fight, would ambush these columns and achieve their old magnificent kill ratios. 5-1, 7-1, 10-1 in exceptional circumstances. And the American columns would absorb the casualties and continue advancing because the equation no longer mattered. There was no exchange rate at which Germany could win. The factories in Detroit were running 3 shifts. The supply ships were crossing the Atlantic in convoys so large they covered the ocean like a steel carpet. The replacement crews were training at bases across America. The fuel was flowing from wells that would never run dry. The parts were stacked in warehouses from England to France to the Rhine. The German crews had laughed at the Sherman's numbers, and the numbers had buried them. Epilogue. There is a cemetery in Normandy where American and German soldiers are buried in separate fields, separated by a road and a wall and history. The American section is marked by white crosses stretching in endless rows, each representing a soldier who died far from home in service of an idea. The German section is smaller, more somber, the headstones bearing names of men who fought for a cause that history has judged harshly. But among the German graves are scattered the names of tank crew members, young men who knew their weapons were superior, who fought with skill and courage, who achieved feats of tactical brilliance that military historians still study. They lie in foreign soil, defeated not by inferior soldiers or cowardice, but by a system they never fully understood. A system that valued production over perfection, that chose overwhelming adequacy over limited excellence, that won not through individual superiority but through collective capacity. The Sherman tank, maligned during the war and criticized after, represents something more profound than its technical specifications suggest. It represents the American way of war, pragmatic, abundant, overwhelming. It was not the best tank. It did not need to be. It was the right tank, built in the right numbers, at the right time, by a nation whose greatest weapon was not technology or courage, but industrial capacity wedded to purpose. The German tank crews laughed at the Sherman's numbers in 1943 because they were calculating war the old way, as a test of quality, of technical superiority, of individual excellence. They learned, too late, that modern industrial war was something different. It was a contest of systems, of logistics, of the capacity to sustain losses and continue fighting. It was a war where victory went not to the best weapon, but to the nation that could produce good enough weapons infinitely. In that contest, the Sherman was not a symbol of American inadequacy. It was a symbol of American inevitability. Each one that rolled off the assembly line in Detroit or Gary or Seattle was a message sent across the Atlantic. We can build them faster than you can destroy them. We can replace them before you can reload. We can sustain this forever, and you cannot. The message was written in steel and delivered at 20 tons per shipment, 50 times per day, every day, until the other side could no longer answer. The laughter died in the dust of Tunisia, and the hedgerows of Normandy, and the forests of the Ardennes. It died when German tank commanders realized they were not fighting an army. They were fighting a factory, and the factory would not stop until victory was achieved or the enemy was destroyed, whichever came first. In the end, the equation was simple. The Sherman won because America could afford to lose 10,000 of them and build 10,000 more. Germany could not. In that difference lay the entire outcome of the armored war in Europe, written not in the moment of combat, but in the production schedules, the supply manifests, the replacement rates, the mundane mathematics of industrial power applied to military purpose. The German tank crews were right about one thing. The Sherman was inferior in single combat. They were wrong about what mattered. In modern war, the battle is not between tanks. It is between systems. And the American system, for all its chaos and inefficiency and democratic messiness, produced an answer to German excellence that could not be defeated. Enough. Enough tanks, enough fuel, enough parts, enough will. Enough industrial capacity to sustain losses that would have broken any other nation and keep advancing, keep producing, keep fighting until the enemy's excellence was buried under the weight of American adequacy, repeated infinitely. That is the legacy of the Sherman. Not glory, but mathematics. Not superiority, but sufficiency. Not the best weapon, but the weapon that won, because winning was never about being the best. It was about being enough, forever, until the other side could no longer continue. The factories in Detroit are silent now. The assembly lines have been retooled for other purposes. The Shermans that survived the war rust in museums and private collections, monuments to a moment when American industrial power rewrote the rules of warfare. But the lesson endures carved, not in stone, but in the historical record. In total war between industrial powers, victory belongs not to the nation with the best weapons, but to the nation that can produce good enough weapons in overwhelming numbers, sustain them in combat, and replace them faster than the enemy can destroy them. The German tank crews laughed at those numbers in 1943. By 1945, those numbers had rewritten history. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence. The silence of exhausted men who had learned that in modern war, abundance is its own form of excellence. And America's abundance was a weapon no amount of technical superiority could overcome,